Preface for this episode. The following material is not suitable for kids. Viewers' discretion is advised. Welcome, Internet Traveler, to the second episode of the Blue Moon podcast, in which we shall meet the most famous, or rather infamous, vampires in the history. As you will see, some of them were part of nobility, even of royal lineage, while others belonged to the commoners. It would seem that when it comes to the thirst for blood, everyone is equal. Where to begin? Perhaps it would be prudent to start with the one historic vampire that everyone knows of, the one whose life and deeds supposedly inspired Bram Stoker's vision of Dracula. Yes, we will start with Vlad Tepes IV. He lived between 1330 and 1376. His reign started in 1456 and lasted until 1462. He was most famous for his battles against the Turks in defense of Christianity. If you search for his portrait on the internet, the first one that comes up is an oil painting by unknown author, created most likely in the second half of the 16th century. In this painting, you will see a man of long, thin face with a somehow pointed jawline and prominent black moustache. His nose, long and sharp, resembles a beak of some predatory bird. He has dark, bulgy eyes with deep shadows under them. He's wearing red clothes with big, round, intricately decorated buttons and a pointy cap adorned with a golden star with a huge ruby stone sitting comfortably in the middle of it. The origin of his name may come from the Latin Draco, which means dragon, but with the Romanian suffix ul, the meaning changes to Dracul, i.e. devil. According to some of the chronicles, his reign was full of terror and cruelty. Apparently, his most favorite pastime was to put his victims on pails or stakes while enjoying lavish meals. Some suggest that using this gruesome way of execution he killed around 100,000 people. And as the annalists would have it, he wasn't the one to show mercy, neither to women nor children. The first were impaled, but not before their breasts were cut off and cooked for their kids to eat. And as if that wasn't enough, the children of the victims were later cooked and dismembered themselves. However, there are historians who suggest that Stoker was inspired by the stories from Saxony, or in broader terms by German tales, which have been the source of the dark legend of this hospodar. Historical sources from Romania view him as a strict but fair ruler who defended the Christian faith, which is in stark contrast to the image the collective has of him. Another historical figure who seems to have lusted for blood was Marshal of France, Gilles de Rais, who lived between 1404 and 1440. He was born to one of the most powerful families of his time, owner of a huge fortune, fought next to Joanna d'Arc. At the same time, according to criminologists, he was one of the most prolific sex offenders in history. Caught in 1440 and then accused of murders, witchcraft, heresy and sodomy. As a result of his trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged and then burned. He was not only deeply fascinated by alchemy and surrounded by sorcerers, but also supposed to look for ways to pledge himself to Satan in order to find the famous Philosopher's Stone. At some point he was advised to search for it within children's blood, and that was how his dark nature caught up with him. When, during his trial, he was asked who made him to do all the horrifying deeds, he replied that he had done all of that based on his own fantasy and ideas, for the sole purpose of pleasure. His modus operandi was to abduct children from nearby villages and then torture and kill them. It is believed that between the year 1432 and 1440 he murdered around 800 kids. In 1992, a French lawyer petitioned to rehabilitate de Rais, saying that he was a victim of clergy conspiring against him, but to no avail. As such, Gilles de Rais remains the historic figure that supposedly inspired the fable of Bluebird. Another person of interest to us is a Hungarian countess, Erzsébet Báthory, 1560–1640, who hailed from a famous Hungarian Transylvanian lineage. She earned a moniker of the Bloody Countess, and similarly to de Rey, surrounded herself with witches, sorcerers, and alchemists. Her castle in Czachtice, in the Carpathian Mountains, today within Slovakia's borders, was a background for a novel by Valentine Penrose called La Comtesse Sanglante, which for sure played a huge role in solidifying her black legend. She is most known for bathing herself in blood of young girls, which was supposed to halt aging process and restore her youthfulness and beauty. This seems to be one of the widespread beliefs about blood which Jean-Paul Roux describes as follows. Bathing, sprinkling oneself or simply anointing with blood proved to be particularly effective if we want to cause growth, strengthen, or rejuvenate. And this ties in to more general belief in blood as a life-giving force. However, Erzsébet was accused also of drinking girls' blood, as well as cutting off pieces of her victims' flesh and, after baking them, asking the wounded to eat those gruesome meals. Similarly to de Rey, she was put on trial with accusations of kidnapping, torturing and murdering of around 600 girls. Women who partook in her crimes were all tortured and burned alive, but because Countess Báthory was from prestigious family, as it is often in such cases, her life was spared. Instead, she was deemed mad and walled up in one of the rooms in her castle, in which she died after 4 years. In the 80s, a Hungarian historian tried to rehabilitate her, pointing out the fact that her own family wanted to disown her and was supposed to manipulate the unfair process from behind the scenes. As in the cases discussed before, this effort was in vain, as she already became a symbol of a vampiress, and in the unpublished notes by Bram Stoker, it seemed that she was supposed to be his inspiration, as originally the vampire in his novel was meant to be a woman. Part 2. Democratic Vampires. So far, the historical vampires we met were all part of aristocracy, and as Maria Janion wrote in her book, they were the main influence for how vampires were shown in the movies. However, Roger Delorme notes that starting from the modern era, another type of a vampire enters the scene, the so-called democratic vampire. Although even before that time, there were mentions of beliefs that a normal, simple person could become a vampire, or even stories about the vampires' epidemics, where entire villages or regions got afflicted. It was the dawn of modernity that brought about visible increase in such stories. The most obvious reason would be a much better written documentation, but also the rise of new discipline of science, the sexuology. Amongst the influential treatises that came out was a work by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Psychopathia Sexualis, 1886, in which, between different descriptions of sexual deviations, vampirism was mentioned. Another researcher who perceived vampirism as a sexual deviation was César Lombroso. A separate category of malefactor was created, namely Lustmörder, whose main traits were thirst for blood as well as need to eat their victims. Lombroso, in his book published in 1873, as well as Krafft-Ebing, both became interested in Vincenzo Verceni, a Venetian, whom the latter dubbed a modern vampire. Vincenzo, as Maria Janion wrote, described himself as a modest person who wasn't a lunatic. He said of himself, "Even today, I have no knowledge of how a woman is built, because I never thought about touching her sexual parts nor even look at them. Instead, what he did was to strangle his victims and drink their blood. From his own recollection, he started from strangling hens on his farm and after some time switched to people. He enjoyed playing with and smelling of intestines of his victims, and at some point he even ate a calf of his cousin, whom he had murdered." In Anomalie et Perversion Sexuelle, Paris, 1935, Dr. Craven describes a female patient who, in his mind, was a perfect example of a vampiress. Apparently all her thoughts circled around human blood, and even on rainy days she would often dream that it was the sanguine fluid raining from the sky. She also imagined killing and eating her husband and kids so that she could taste their blood. These trends in psychiatry inspired a series of articles published in Pravda between 1887 and 1888 by Ludwik Krzywicki. He was interested in the so-called blood craze and believed that the newest discoveries by psychiatrists and psychologists could be the key to explain werewolves phenomenon as well as cannibalism. Roger Delorme, mentioned previously, was also keen to explain vampirism as a sign of sexual pathology, and to illustrate this line of thinking he described several cases of true vampires who lived in the 20th century. Among them, two deserve to be mentioned: Peter Kürten, the vampire of Düsseldorf, and Stanisław Modzelewski, the vampire from Gałkówek. Peter Kürten's modus operandi was to attack women and children with a knife at night, and then drink blood straight from the fatal wounds he inflicted. Afterwards, he would go back to his city life, seemingly switching off the vampire persona and becoming an average husband and citizen. During his trial, he was shouting at the judges that they would never be able to understand him, that no one would. He was guillotined in 1931. Montag Summers commented about another vampire who was decapitated in 1925 that this mode of killing a vampire was always perceived as the surest to succeed. The vampire from Gałkówek killed a total of 7 women starting from 1952. He would rape, strangle and drink blood from their open throats, often when the victims were still alive. He was a blood connoisseur, describing it to be sweet and thick like cocoa. As Kürten, he also was a husband and father, worked as an official. When hunting for his victims, he would clad himself black from head to toes, with black mask covering his face and a wide-brimmed hat. He was convicted in Łódź and sentenced to death in 1969. Another famous Polish vampire was Zdzisław Marchwicki, perhaps the best known under the nickname of Vampire from Zagłębie. He was accused of 14 murders and 6 attempted murders between 1964 and 1970. The inability of local police led to panic, especially in 1965 when he killed 9 women. As a result, a special militia unit in Katowice was established, and there was also a huge bounty put on his head of 1 million złotych. Finally, in 1972, a suspect was arrested alongside his siblings who were accused of helping him commit his crimes. He stood a public trial in 1974-1975, and as a result, both him and his brother Jan received death penalty. Throughout his process, Zdzisław Marchwicki consistently said that he was innocent, which was a sentiment shared by his lawyer, who stated that during the trial his client acted as if he was hounded. According to the lawyer, the state invested a lot of resources, even engaged the entire giant state apparatus against which the poor and goofy Zdzisław Marchwicki had nothing. When it comes to hard or even circumstantial evidence against him, there were none, and indeed he claimed his innocence until the very end. Still, he was sentenced to death, as apparently the Communist Party needed this success. 20th century brought with it also the love for science and scientific explanation, and thus there were a couple of attempts to explain away historic records of vampires and plagues of thereof, with a couple of different diseases. As with the 19th century, when the researchers concentrated on psyche and thus tended to search for answers within different types of psychosis, the next century focused more on other types of maladies. Back in the 80s, one of such scientific explanations for vampirism was brought to the general public's attention, a notion that at least in some cases in the past, people who were accused of being vampires were in fact ill and suffered from the mysterious and rare blood illness called porphyria became quite popular. Apparently, as this disease may be genetic, some researchers suggested that it could have been a reason behind the stories of entire vampire lineages. Amongst the traits exhibited by people afflicted with porphyria are sensitivity to sunlight, skin deformations, excessive hair growth, extension of lips and gums which causes teeth to show, visual and audio hallucinations, and comatosis. In similar vein, Juan Gomez Alonso published his article in Neurology in 1998, in which he argued that there were certain similarities between people accused of vampirism and those who had rabies, such as aversion to light, water and mirrors, aggressiveness, and increased sexual appetite. During an attack of rabies, the infected person expresses tendency to bite other people, and because the pathogen can be transferred through saliva, there is a chance that the victim who was bitten will also develop the same symptoms. According to Gomez Alonso, the stories of vampires could be linked to rape epidemics in Hungary and in the Balkan Peninsula. Of course, the psychiatric explanation still had its ground in the search of the cause for vampirism, and in 1972 Lawrence Keighton believed that vampires were suffering from schizophrenia. Still, no matter which explanation sounds more plausible for you, it is nevertheless true that the creatures of the night, feasting on human blood, remain an important part of our common imagination and continue to haunt us. And with that, I wish you farewell and safe travels, Internet Wanderer. Postscriptum. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please leave a like on the video or a comment beneath it so that I know to prepare more content like this one. For now, I invite you to give a listen to the vampire-related audiobooks already available on the channel, and for more vampire lore, please check out the first episode of this podcast. Take care.